Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf kuf daled. It's the daf for Shabbat. I'm going to start from a quick review of one line of the Mishnah, and then we're going to get started on the Gemara from the bottom of Kuf Gimel Amud Bet. I decided because it was a little bit of a complicated section that I wouldn't deal with it at the very end of class on Friday, but deal with it on today's daf, and let's get started. Okay, so first half of today's daf is going to be quite complicated until we get to the Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Daled Amud Aleph. Then it will be smooth sailing, a little bit simpler. Okay, we're starting with this topic we saw in the previous Mishnah, the Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph. Kol HaKodeshim shira be'em sul kodem lev sheitan ein orotehem lekohanim. If the disqualification happened before the hide was removed, then the or doesn't go to the kohanim because the whole thing was disqualified as a unit. La'achar hev sheitan, but if it was disqualified after the hide already came off, if you remember, we're talking about an ola, where the meat's supposed to be burned on the altar, and the hide goes to the kohanim. So if it was already separated and then the meat became disqualified, it's already detached from the hide can still go to the kohanim, even though the meat can't be burned on the altar. That's what the Mishnah said. The problem is that the previous Mishnah, if you remember, from the top of Daf Kuf Gimel, we didn't learn it so long ago, said, and then we're going to start reading from the Gemara. Then the Gemara starts quoting that sentence, Kol shelo zacha mizbeach b'psara lo zachu hakohanim ba'ora. It said there that what's the determining factor? Not was the hide detached when it got disqualified or attached when it got disqualified, but it says it all depends on, did the altar already was it prepared or be worthy of the flesh, the meat being burned on it? Meaning, in other words, was the blood sprinkled before it got disqualified or after it got disqualified? Okay, that's what seems to be the determining factor, the sprinkling of the blood. If the blood was sprinkled, which basically, and before it got disqualified, which permitted the meat to be burned, and then the meat got disqualified, doesn't matter, okay? Afagav de ifshetela or kodem zrika. In other words, actually I should go with the case where it doesn't work. If it got disqualified before the meat went on, before the blood got sprinkled on the altar, then even if we sprinkle the blood on the altar, right, at this point, well, that's not going to permit the meat because the meat's already disqualified, then the hide is not going to go to the kohanim. And it doesn't make a difference whether it was separated, right? Even whether the or was separated before the zrika or after the zrika, right? It doesn't make a difference when the hide was separated from the animal, okay? That from the flesh. That's an irrelevant factor. The only relevant factor is, was it disqualified before the blood, in which case it was never permitted to go on the altar of the meat. It didn't even have a moment where it's permitted, and therefore, no, you can't give the hide to the kohanim. Or was it after the blood? Meaning at the moment the blood was put on the altar, already the meat becomes permitted. Oh, then it got disqualified? Okay, what's the difference? There was a moment where it worked, so of course we can't burn the meat, but yes, the hide can be given to the kohanim. Okay? So it all depends on, did it have a moment or not where zacha mizbeach, the altar became worthy for the meat. Those are two completely different things. One is, was it separated or together? And the other is, was the blood sprinkled and the meat worthy to go on the altar for a moment, or did it never have that moment? So if we go with the first Mishnah, comes the Gemara and says, Mani, that first Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon hi. Da'amar ein hadam meratzeh ala or b'fnei atzmo. The blood does not help permit the or. In other words, if the blood, is not going to be able to have meat there, if the or is disqualified from before, then, right, if it's part of the meat and it was all disqualified before the zrika, then the zrika is not going to help you without the meat, okay? You need blood and meat to be able to go on the altar in order to permit the or. That's Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon's shita, which we're going to see very soon in the Braita. But Ema Seifa, but this next Mishnah that we just said that it has nothing to do with zrika or not. Kol HaKodeshim shira be'em sul kodem ef sheitan ein oroten lekohanim v'lachar ef sheitan oroten lekohanim. Right? If the disqualification happened while it was all one piece, then we don't give the or to the kohanim because the whole thing was disqualified as a unit. And after it was separated, it became disqualified. Then it goes to the kohen. That whole issue is based on hefshet. Was it together or was it separated already? And that is Atan Rebbe. That works like Rebbe, because what did Rebbe say? Da'amar hadam miratzeh or b'fnei atzmo. The blood can atone for the or, meaning if, okay, now what's going to have to be according to Rebbe? And we're going to see this in Rebbe very soon when we see it inside, because they kind of assume you know this machloket even though you don't yet, and soon maybe they don't really assume because they say, okay, who's Rebbe, who's Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon, what did they say? And we'll bring the Breita. But basically what Rebbe is going to say is like this. It all depends, he's going to say exactly what the Breita, what the Mishnah here says. It all depends on whether it was together or separated at the time it became disqualified. Which means, and what he's also going to say is, if it was already separated, the first thing happened is, okay, we slaughter the animal, we take off the hide from the meat, we separate them, then the meat gets disqualified. Oh, the hide was already separated. So yeah, sprinkle the blood, okay? Or if you sprinkled the blood, let's say you did it, maybe you're not really supposed to because already the meat got disqualified, but let's say you sprinkled the blood anyway. The blood can permit, okay, that's what he says here, hadam miratzeh or b'fnei atzmo. The blood has the power to permit, because nothing's permitted until the blood is sprinkled. So, right, the meat is permitted for the altar in general, and the hide is permitted to the kohanim. Before the blood sprinkled, the kohen has no rights to the hide. So, when that happens, that basically can, even though it can't permit the meat now because the meat is disqualified, right? Like let's say it's impure or something, but it does permit the hide to be given to the kohanim. That's Rebbe. Okay. So now we have a super confusing Mishnah. We have the first Mishnah, Reisha, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Seifa, Rebbe, right? One says the whole, and they completely conflict. One says it all depends on before Sarika, after Sarika, when did it get disqualified? The other one said all depends on was it together or separate at the time. If it was already separated before it got disqualified, we can view the or separately and give it to the kohanim. If it was all together, then it's one unit and gets disqualified, the whole thing. So how do we explain this? So Rav and Abai each going to have different explanations. One's going to say, I'm going to explain the whole thing according to Rebbe, and the other's going to say, I can explain the whole thing according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. So I'm Rabbi. Me to say for Rebbe, okay, let's start with our Mishnah as the basis. The end Mishnah is Rebbe. So therefore, Reishanami Rebbe. Let's assume the first Mishnah is like Rebbe also. Now, how are you going to explain Rebbe? Because Rebbe said it all depends on was it together or separate. That's not at all what the first Mishnah said. The first Mishnah said it all depends on sprinkling blood, not sprinkling blood. Well, he's going to connect those two issues, because what does he say? Mode Rebbe she'en efshei kodem zrika. Now, I described to you this situation where somebody slaughters, takes off the hide, and then sprinkles the blood. That's a ridiculous way to do things. Why? We've talked a lot of times before about, or a few times, we're always worried the blood's going to coagulate. Now, if you're worried the blood's going to coagulate, well, then what are you going to do? You're not going to slaughter the animal, then take a break, take off the hide, and then sprinkle the blood, right? You can do it the reverse. You're going to sprinkle the blood, and then do the hefshet. So basically, after, right, the whole, we're going to equate almost, or not exactly, but for practical reasons, that you might decide to do it that way. But that's not the way it's normally done. And what the first halacha is talking about in the Mishnah is not a halacha like this is a law. This is just what normally happens. In other words, okay, let's just read the line. All the Kodeshim, they had, Kol shelo zacham mizbeach v'sara lo zachu kohanim ba'ora. If the mizbeach, meaning if you didn't sprinkle the blood, then the kohanim won't get the or. Why? Because every time you sprinkle the blood, let's say you sprinkle the blood and immediately gets disqualified, well, it's obviously then, or it got disqualified before, his whole thing is if it got disqualified before you sprinkled the blood, that's more correct, sorry about that. If it gets disqualified before you sprinkle the blood, it's 99% of the time, it's going to be attached. So that's really one and the same thing. And if it's after, it's likely you've already separated it. Okay? And that's why what it's really saying is, if it did, the blood, and notice it's not even talking about the other case, it's really talking about if the blood didn't go on the altar, okay, then it's almost 99% of the time, the hide is still on. And that's why it's not going to be allowed to go to the kohanim, because it was disqualified together with the meat, because it was all together. That's Rebbe's whole theory. So that's how Abai explains it. Rava Amar, Mideresha, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Sefanami, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. He's going to explain the whole thing according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. But this is going to have to do a little editing or interpretation. He says, my kodim. Now remember, what was Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon? Like the previous Mishnah, the whole thing's all zrikadam, the sprinkling of the blood. So why is it in our Mishnah all about, was it separated or not before flaying after flaying the hide. So what is kodem hefshet? Umay achar hefshet. What does that really mean? We're finally getting to our daf now. Kodem shenir'u lehefshet. Before it became potentially able to be flayed, which is achar, right? So before it could potentially have been flayed, which is before zrika, and after achar shenir'u lehefshet, after it could be potentially flayed, that's after zrika. And then it's exactly the same thing. And then it fits together, and that's all Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon. So now we've explained both ways, right? We can either explain both Mishnayot according to Rabbi or both according to Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon. Now we're going to finally get to the Breita and see their opinions in depth, but we already understand them. This will be a good review. My Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon. So where do we see their opinions? Ditanya. We quote a Breita. Rabbi Yomer. Adam mechatzela or b'fnei atzmo. The blood atones for the hide on its own. Now, but it's really more than that. It's not just that. It's kishehuim abasal. If it's together with the flesh, they're all one unit. No labu psul bein kodem zrika bein lachar zrika reu kayotzebo. If it's together, it doesn't matter whether you've sprinkled the blood, whether you haven't sprinkled the blood. It's together with the flesh. So if the flesh is disqualified, so is the blood. So is the hide. Okay, but what obviously comes to there, what does he mean, hadam meratzela or b'fnei atzmo? But if the hide was separate, right? If the hide was separate from the or, then the blood will permit that hide to be, right? So if it got disqualified after it was already separated, the blood that you sprinkled, either before or after, it doesn't really matter according to Rebbe. Now remember, we said most likely it's going to actually be flayed later, but it doesn't matter either which one. If you did do it before, the blood actually enables the hide to be permitted. Okay? It all depends on when the disqualification happened, before or after it was flayed. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer, ein adam meratzela or b'fnei atzmo. The blood is not enough. You can't have the blood, the sprinkling of the blood, permit the hide for the kohanim, because kashuim abasal nolab b'psul kodem zrika hareu kayotzebo. It all just depends. When it's with the basal, when they're together, and the psul happens before zrika hareu kayotzebo. It doesn't matter whether it's separated or not, right? The truth is, he says when it's together, right, and it all gets disqualified before zrika, and then hareu kayotzebo, and then we're going to treat the hide just like the flesh. No way, how are we going to allow this? Achar zrika, but if it's after zrika, hurtza basar sha'achad. Now he goes even farther to say like this. Okay, now remember what the Mishnah said, and this we said matched him. If the mizbeach lo zachad, you didn't sprinkle the blood, then there's no way you're going to be able to have the hide, whether it was attached or not attached when the disqualification happened. Okay, he doesn't spell that out, but that's obvious what he says. But once the zrika happens, and that's the inverse of the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said if it's not zoche b'bsara, the kohanim don't get it. But if already the basar, the blood was sprinkled on the altar, and at that moment nothing had been disqualified yet, and it permitted the hide to be, right, permitted everything, the meat for the altar, and therefore also the hide for the kohanim. Hurtza basar sha'acha, once the meat were for one moment, it doesn't matter, it could be an hour, it could be a moment, for one moment it was fine until it got disqualified. Yep, then it actually, already the hide was permitted to the kohanim. So what do? Even if it's together now, and the whole thing got disqualified as a unit, which according to Rebbe would be a major problem, because the hide is attached, and therefore the whole thing is disqualified. But here he says no, because already we had a moment it was permitted for the altar. That's what's important to us. So Yafshitenu v'orel the kohanim. Now, okay, you can't do the meat now, but you could have potentially done it after you sprinkled the blood. So now you can actually take off the hide right now, and then give the hide to the kohanim, and obviously the meat is disqualified. There's nothing you can do about that. So that's their machloket. Now we're going to suggest that maybe their machloket is based on another machloket between two Tanaim, Rabbi Eliezer, don't confuse him with Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Shimon, and actually they're going to be on opposite sides of the machloket here. Maybe they argue about the same thing, because now remember in essence, one of the main things they say is, can the blood atone for the or by itself? Okay, which basically Rebbe said, which is, even if the hide is already disqualified, the meat is already disqualified before, but if they were separate and you sprinkle the blood basically permits the or to go to the kohanim. Because remember, before the blood is sprinkled, there's no way you could give the hide to the kohanim. So only when the blood is sprinkled, that permits the kohanim to get the hide. Rabbi Shimon says, no way, no how. The blood, if it gets disqualified before, the blood, number one, don't sprinkle the blood. Number two, if you did anyway, it doesn't do anything because there's no blood without meat. If you're already at a stage where the meat can't be brought on the altar, of course you can't sprinkle the blood. And of course, if you did, it's totally ineffective even for the hide. That's what he says. So now we're going to see that exact distinction in Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Basita olotecha habasar v'hadam. Okay, here's a pasuk in Dvarim. It says you should bring your olot, habasar v'hadam. Now notice basar and dam are together, blood and meat, al mizbach Hashem Elokecha, on the altar of God. And then it says, dam zvachecha yishafecha mizbach Hashem Elokecha. The beginning of the pasuk talks about blood and meat. And the second part of the pasuk just says, and you're going to spill the blood of your sacrifices on the mizbech. And there's no mention of meat there at all. So one's going to focus on the beginning, and one's going to focus on the end of the pasuk. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, im ein dam, ein basar, im basar ein dam. What if, okay, it's a little different case, but what if you lose the dam? What if it spills and you don't have it anymore? Or you lose the meat, okay? It disappears somewhere. You don't know where it is, okay? Or it gets disqualified or something like that. Well, if you don't have blood, you can't do the meat. If you don't have meat, you can't do the blood. Okay, when you stand there to sprinkle the blood, you need to have everything in front of you or know where it is and be able to do both. Which means, again, if the meat got disqualified before the blood was sprinkled, then of course it's not going to help the hide either. Okay, that's Rabbi Yeshua matches Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon. It's all a matter of, did you do zrika or not, right? If it got disqualified before zrika, it's going to be a problem. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, dam af pishay basar. What do you mean? You could do the blood without the basar because he focuses on the second part of the pasuk. Shene'emar v'dam zvachecha yishafech. The blood of your sacrifices should be spilled on the altar, meaning blood can work on its own. And okay, so it won't permit the meat for the altar, but it could permit the hide as long as, obviously you have to add, as long as the hide was separated from the meat when it got disqualified. And that is exactly Rebbe. So Imken, now he continues in the Braita. Rabbi Eliezer says, Imken matam alomar. He told us basar v'adam. What does to do with the beginning part of the pasuk where it connects the basar and the dam? It's a totally different issue. We're going to learn something else from it, which is just kind of, what does he do with that? Lomar l'chama dam b'zlika af basar b'zlika. It's to tell you, just like the blood gets thrown, also the meat gets thrown. You might remember we learned this. Halamadta shelevach yesh ben kevesh lemizbeach. This teaches you that there was a gap between the ramp and the altar, and the kohanim would throw it from the ramp onto the altar. Okay, now, so we tried to set this up and it seemed perfectly set up, right? Now we're going to say it explicitly. Lema manda amar hurtza ke Rabbi Eliezer, umanda amar lo hurtza ke Rabbi Yeshua. Right, the one who said that the blood works must hold, that was Rebbe, must hold like Rabbi Eliezer. And the one who says it doesn't work must hold like Rabbi Yeshua. But they're now going to say not necessarily. Aliba de Rabbi Eliezer. If you go with Rabbi Eliezer, who basically says the blood works by itself, okay, well, there's no way to explain that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon's going to hold like him. So therefore, kolei amalo pligi. In other words, they don't disagree about how to understand Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, Rebbe's going to say I hold exactly like Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Shimon's going to say I completely disagree with him. But ki pligi aliba de Rabbi Yeshua. But within Rabbi Yeshua, we're going to see that even though it seems much more clear, like Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, it all depends on Srika, we're going to have a way to explain it that Rebbe could say, oh, he holds like me too. He just would make a distinction in my case, okay? We differentiate between the cases. So now we're going to say like this. So, Manda Amar Lo Hurtza Ki Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, who says the blood doesn't work without the meat, okay, he's going to hold the same thing as Rabbi Yeshua explicitly, exactly. Manda Amar Hurtza, but if you say like Rebbe that it works, he's going to say like this. Amar lech, ad kan lo kam Rabbi Yeshua hatam ele bebasal delay kapseda lekohanim. He's talking about if you lost the blood, can you do the meat? If you lost the meat, can you do the blood? And the answer is no. And you have to just throw out the whole korban, right? And basically make the owner bring a new korban. Now at that point, there's no loss for the kohanim. Why? Because I told you before, you might not remember, but the kohanim don't get rights to the hide until the blood is sprinkled. At this point, we're standing before the blood is sprinkled in his case, right? They're all saying, okay, there's no blood, don't do the meat. There's no meat, don't do the blood. Obviously, we're standing before the blood is sprinkled. So there's no loss for the kohanim because the or didn't belong to them yet. It wasn't potentially theirs, right? It was only later it'll be theirs if you sprinkle the blood, but you haven't even done that, so it doesn't not owned by them. Aval or but in our case, where the blood potentially could have been sprinkled already, and now it gets disqualified, where there's going to be a loss for the kohanim if you basically say, sorry, we're going to just disqualify the or. Afilu Rabbi Yeshua modeh. Rabbi Yeshua would agree that if the blood was sprinkled already, then maybe we could say, you know what? If the blood was sprinkled, even if, right, the meat was already disqualified, but if the blood was sprinkled, and theoretically that should permit the or of the kohanim, and if we now say, oh no, the kohanim can't get it, we're actually causing them a loss. So maybe he would agree in that case, and we're now going to have a proof why he would say this. Midi dehavi adiavad, okay, just like he says in a post facto case somewhere else, or some people, Rashi has a better gear side thing. But even though this is also b'diavad, the blood was already sprinkled, so let's just allow it. But like he says, biyotze, okay, like in a case where it leaves the temple, you're going to see right now, de Tanya, it should be Tanya, not Tanan, it says in a Braita, nitma basaro nifsal, if the blood became impure or disqualified, oshi asachutz l'klaim, or it left the azara, Rabbi Eliezer Omer yizrok. Rabbi Eliezer says you can sprinkle the blood. That matches exactly what he says here, right? Because the blood can be used for the or, right? And you can still do the blood even though you're not going to have the meat, and you won't be able to do the meat. But Rabbi Yeshua says lo yizrok. He says you can't, which matches what he does here, right? Without the meat, don't do the basar, don't do the blood. But it adds in this bright modeh Rabbi Yeshua she'im zarak hortza. But if you already did it, he actually agrees that it would work. So now you see that there is some place where Rabbi Yeshua holds, if the blood was already sprinkled, we will allow the blood to permit. Then Rabbi could say, oh look, he'll hold like me in our case, even though he doesn't hold like that. In the case where you're standing before Zerika and you have to say, okay, can I do the Zerika or can I burn the meat when I don't have the other? That's a different case, because that's a lechatchila, standing, before the action happens. Okay, so that is that whole section, which again, if we review very briefly, we had contradiction between our Mishnah and the previous Mishnah. One seems to match Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. One seems to match Rebbe very clearly, but we figured out a way to explain according to Rebbe, and we figured out a way to explain according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. And then we brought their machloket, and then we said, oh, it looks like their machloket. Looks like the same machloket as Rabbi Yeshua and the Rabbi Eliezer. And then we said, not necessarily. Okay, now we're going to move on to Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, who appears in the Mishnah. And he says, I've never seen or that went to the Beit HaSreifa. So basically he's saying, when we said before that if the psul, the disqualification happened before we took off the hide, then the whole thing's going to be burnt. He says, I've never seen them burn the hide before. I know what you're talking about. Now, the Gemara says, what do you mean, below? And we're going to ask, I think it's 4. I forgot to count exactly, but I think there's 4 difficulties on this, and that's going to end our section and move to the next Mishnah, which is, as I said, a little more simple. Below, number 1, Hare Parim HaNisrafim, Usirim HaNisrafim. Okay, we're going to get to these in the next Mishnah, which is, if you remember, we've talked about these many times, in Horayot especially, the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibor, the Par Kohen HaMashiach, right, when someone makes a mistake and they follow a mistaken ruling. We have the Parim and Sirim on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, the ones on Yom Kippur. We have also the Avodah Zarah one, where the people sin, that's the Seir. Okay. Anyway, you have all these things. What's unique about them? Well, we sprinkle the blood on the inner altar, which is already different. We burn some of the parts on the outer altar. But then we take the animal, we don't eat it, we don't burn it on the altar. What do? We burn it outside Jerusalem, completely outside what we call the Shalosh Machanot, okay, the Shekhinah, Leviah, and Yisrael, which was based on the desert model, which for us, right, the Yisrael is Jerusalem. Okay. So, what about those? What do you mean? They get burnt, the hide gets burnt there. So they say, "Lemitzvatan lo kamrinan." I wasn't saying when there's a mitzvah to burn it. Of course the hide gets burnt when there's a mitzvah. I was talking about when there's no mitzvah. Okay, second question. Hare kodem hefshet v'kodem zrika. What if before, okay, let's just take all the opinions that we saw. What if before it got disqualified, it was already separated, and it got disqualified before zrika? So then you would obviously burn the hide. Everyone would agree with that. So we said, I didn't say that right. Before it was flayed. Maybe I said it right, but I had it wrong in my head. Before it was flayed, if it got disqualified when the whole thing was whole, and it was before the zrikat dam, so of course you're going to burn the hide. Okay, you're going to burn the animal with the hide on it. So I say, okay, chalutz kamrina. I meant that I've never seen them burn the hide on its own. Of Of course, if it got disqualified together and it was before Zrikat time, we're going to just burn the whole animal. But I'm talking about when it was separated. I've never seen it separated and burned. Okay, third case. Ha'ika achar hefshet v'kodem zrika l'Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon. Damar ein adam meratzela or b'fnei atzmo. Okay, we're not done with Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi yet. What about if it was after it was already flayed, but before zrika, according to Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon? So now it's separated, and you were talking about how you've never seen it burn separated. And according to Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon, if it happened before this blood was sprinkled, then yeah, you would burn it. So what do you do with that? Right? And he said, if you drew the blood, it's not going to help the ore and allow it to go to the Kohanim. So Rabbi Chanina ki Rabbi Svirale, you just said Rabbi Chanina held like Rabbi, and that's why that wasn't an issue for him, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. Or Ibait Ema, Filu Chugman Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, or maybe you could explain it like Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, but you could say that Modeh Rabbi She'en Afshei Kodem Zrika. Remember, what did we say? Rebbe said, and we're assuming Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon would agree with this, they don't generally do hefshet before Zrika. So you're not going to have a case of that because we already said nobody flays them before because otherwise the blood's going to coagulate. So because of that, there really is no case. It never happened because it never happened that there was hefshet before Zrika. So Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon would never have it disqualified because it always, once the Zrika's done, right, then it's not going to be disqualified. Okay. So fourth question. Ha'ika, I was right, there's 4 questions. This we didn't discuss yet. If you slaughter an animal and it turns out it was a treifa, and you find out it was a treifa in the b'nei me'ayim, so you have to bury the animal. So now they say, kasavar nimtzei treifa b'nei me'ayim meratze. Oh, maybe he holds that you don't have to bury it, and that if you sprinkle the blood, like let's say, okay, let's talk about the order. You slaughtered the animal. You sprinkled the blood. Only after that did you realize it was a treifa. Then it actually permits that animal, and then again, the hide wouldn't be disqualified. Okay? So now they say, and daikanami dekatani, and actually you could really prove this from the continuation of the Mishnah, because if you remember, the Mishnah, Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, say this statement of his, I've never seen an animal be burned. Came Rabbi Akiva and he added, midvarav lamanu shamafshita tabachor v'nimsat treifa. Okay, we actually saw this yesterday, right? If you take off the hide of the animal, and then it turns out it was a treifa, in other words, you slaughtered it, took off the hide, and only later did you find out it was a treifa, you could give that to the Kohanim. So what do you see? So midvarav lamanu shamafshita tabachor v'nimsat treifa she'ot to the Kohanim ba'rosh mamina. What do you see from here? It doesn't. You would think, well, the animal was a treifa to begin with. It was disqualified before, but no. We go by now. It was disqualified after it was already separated because it goes by when you discovered it was disqualified. So we'll say the same thing with the treifa that we said before. If you find out it was a treifa later after it was already flayed, then and after you sprinkled the blood, then it's miratze. It permits the hide of that animal to go to the Kohen. And that's why we wouldn't burn it. And that's why that's not the case, because he must hold this way. Again, this is only Rabbi Chanina. Not everyone would hold this way. Other people say, no, it has to be buried or burned, right? The hide maybe have to be burned. But anyway, Rabbi Chanina says, I've never seen that because I don't hold that way. And Rabbi Akiva proves it because he's basically saying the same thing. Now, the Gemara says, wait a minute. If it's so clear that that's what Rabbi Chanina is saying, then why would Rabbi Akiva bother to tell us? Rabbi Akiva has to tell us something we didn't know. So Elamai Kamashmalan Rabbi Akiva, what's he trying to teach us by telling us this? That basically, again, what's he teaching us? If you flayed the animal, or if you sprinkled the blood, flayed the animal, right, it became disqualified, and then and then you found out it was a treifa after that, then it would be permitted, right? Now, you'd be able to give the hide to the Kohanim. But Rabbi Chanina, Hakamashmalan Afilu Bigvulin. The chiddush here is, let's talk about Bechor. Bechor is something that basically is given to the Kohanim, and the Kohanim have to bring it to the temple and sacrifice it. But if it's blemished, they can slaughter it at home. But if they slaughter it at home, let's say the same thing happens at home. Now, you might say, maybe it's the sprinkling of the blood that permitted this whole thing. Like we talked about before, the sprinkling of the blood is miratze, it appeases. And that permits the Kohanim to enjoy the hide, right, to get the hide. Maybe in a Bechor case, where it's a balmum, and again, what happened? You slaughtered it, you took off the hide, so it was already separated, then you found out it was a treifa. Comes Rabbi Akiva to say, we're going to treat that the same as if it was in the temple. And we're going to permit the hide to that Kohen who owns this animal now. Why are we going to permit it? It's missing the sprinkling of the blood. But no, it's not the sprinkling of the blood that's important. It's the fact that the hide was separated from the animal at the time. So that's what's going to allow us to permit the hide to the Kohen, even outside the temple, even when there's no sprinkling of the blood. Okay, that's end of the hard part for today. Now we're just going to end this sugya with Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan Halakha Rabbi Akiva. So we paskin actually like Rabbi Akiva in this case of the blemished bechor. Okay, that if we find out it's a treifa after, even right when it's blemished and you're just eating it in your courtyard, and the kohen can, so now he can't eat the beak because it's a treifa, but he can benefit from the hide. But Rabbi Akiva lo amal, but one caveat, only elakashitiro mumche. Only if a mumche said it's a mum. Now, for a kohen to eat a blemished animal, it's not enough for the kohen to just say, oh, I see this animal's blemished. They have to go to a specialist who can determine this is a blemished animal. So only if he went to a mumche who said this was a blemished animal, not if he just decided on his own, that wouldn't work. Okay, okay, that's just a small qualification. But the Gemara says, after Rabbi Yochanan said we paskin like Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara says, I'm going to skip the next 4 words. There's a lot of problems with the Girsa'ot here. I'm not going to get into all the details. It's actually a bit of a debate what we paskin like Chachamim about. But it seems like we paskin like Chachamim either against Rabbi Akiva here about the case of the blemished bechor, or it could be, I hope I didn't say blemished kohen before, I meant blemished bechor, right? That the bechor is blemished. And Hilchot HaGivrei Chachamim, right? It could be against Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim in the Mishnah in general. Okay, moving on now to the next Mishnah. Parim and Nisrafim, Usirim and Nisrafim. I told you we get to these. Okay, so now we're going to learn about how they did the whole ceremony with the Parim and Nisrafim. Not all of it, but specifically about where we burn it. So, and some other details about it. Bisman shehem nisrafim kemitzvatan. If they're burned properly, meaning everything was done properly, and we take it out to the Beit Hadeshen, nisrafim beBeit Hadeshen, and that's this place outside Jerusalem that they burn it. Umitamim begadim, and the clothes that the Kohen's wearing, the Kohanim who deal with the burning of it, and we're going to see exactly at what point they become, there's a machloket in the Mishnah about at what point they become impure. But not only are they impure, but their clothes become impure. The clothes they're wearing, some people think it actually means anything they touch at all. They're an avatuma, which means they could be matame kelim. Any kind of vessel or clothing becomes impure. V'im einam nisrafim kemitzvatan. The Mishnah continues, what if they're not burnt properly, meaning they became disqualified at some point? Nisrafim beBeit Habira. They get burned in the Beit Habira, which we're going to see 2 opinions about what that is. Rashi tells us right now. Sometimes that means in the Azarah, sometimes in Harabayit. We're going to see this. And when they burn the disqualified one, that doesn't cause this impurity of your clothes. By the way, the whole thing about the clothes comes up in the Torah. It says it explicitly, specifically in Yom Kippur, okay, in Vayikra Tetzai. Continuing along in the Mishnah of how they would do this, they would now carry these big animals out on poles. Yatzua Rishonim. Now you've got 4 people, like imagine people carrying a stretcher. So the first 2 get out of the Azarah first. Chutz lechomata azara. Okay, yatzua rishonim chutz lechomata azara. So the first 2 leave the azara first. Bachronim lo yatzu, but the ones behind are still in the azara. Okay, you can imagine the situation. Harishonim etamim begadim. Okay, according to Tanakama, you become impure as soon as you walk out the azara door. So the first 2 are going to become impure right away, whereas the achronim etam etamim begadim ad sheyatzu. They're obviously going to become impure only once they leave. Yatzu, once they leave, elu ve'elu etamim begadim. Okay, this is kind of obvious, but once they leave, everyone's going to be, all 4 of them are going to be impure because they're all outside. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ein tamim until much later, ad shiyutzata or beruban, until the fire that they burn outside Jerusalem, until the fire starts burning the majority of the animal. Nitacha basar, once the meat then becomes completely or mostly consumed, ein hasoref metamei begadim. If you come in later and start doing some work with it, helping finish up the burning, once it hits that stage of mostly consumed, it's not metame begadim anymore. So there's a window. Okay, where does it start? Where does it end? Okay, there's machlok about where it starts. It seems clear where it ends. My bira. So the first question of the Gemara is, what's this bira? Where is it? Amar Rabbi Barchan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Makom yesh b'Harabayit bira shmo. It was a specific place in Harabayit. They don't tell you exactly where, but it was a specific place. Rish Lakish Amar Kol Habayit Kulo Karoi Bira. The whole Temple Mount area is called bira, or the whole Beit Hamikdash. Exactly what they mean is a good question. But Shenemar, how do we know? Habira asher achinoti. When David is about to die in Divrei Hayamim, there's a prayer he says for the safety of his son and for the Beit Hamikdash to be built by his son. And he says he calls it the Bira asher achinoti. So that means the temple, basically. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua. Now we're going to have Rav Nachman and the Rav Ravua talk about these three places called the Beit HaDeshen, and which things get burned where, and then we're going to see a different Braita that Levi brings that has a bit of one minor change or a major change. Okay, there were three places where things were burned that were called the Beit HaDeshen. Beit HaDeshen Gadol Haya Ba'azara. There was a big one in the Azara itself. What was it used for? Shesham Sorfim Psulei Kodshe Kodshim. Any Kodshe Kodshim that got disqualified had to be burned there, right? You had meat, got disqualified, you burn it there. Right? Anything that got disqualified. V'imulei Kodshim Kalim. And Kodshim Kalim, the parts that have to be burned on the altar, they have to be left in the Azara. If they become disqualified, they also get burned in the Azara in the Beit HaDeshen. And third, Parim and Israfim, Usirim and Israfim. Here's the one that's going to be a machloket. The Parim, the ones that are brought on the inner altar, right, and then eventually brought to be burned in the Beit HaDeshen, if Iram Emsul Kodem Srika, if they become disqualified before the blood is sprinkled. Okay? Because before the blood is sprinkled, the blood sprinkling basically permits them to be brought outside. But until then, they're not permitted to be brought outside. So if they become disqualified, they get burned inside. Ubeit HaDeshen Acher Haya B'Har HaBayit. The second one was in the Har HaBayit. Shesham, right, more on the Temple Mount, not in the temple. Shesham Sorfim, what would they burn there? Parim and Israfim, Usirim and Israfim, Shira Be'em Sul Achar Zrika. Okay, the next category is, what if the Parim and Israfim with the Usirim and Israfim become disqualified once they leave the Azara walls? Well, then we're not going to bring them back into the Azara. We're going to burn them on the temple. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. After Zrika, after the blood was sprinkled, they're already potentially permitted to be brought outside. So if they get disqualified at that stage, we're going to bring them outside to burn them. Uche mitzvatan, and the third obviously is when you do them the right way and they don't get disqualified at all, the Parim and the Sirim and the Srafim, chutz l'shalosh machanot. Then they get burned in the Beit HaDeshen that we talked about in our Mishnah. Tani Levi, but Levi says, Shlosha batei shanima. You now see why I got confused, because I accidentally said Levi's opinion before. There's three Batei Deshen. So we're going to start the same. Beit HaDeshen Agadol Haya Ba'Azara. That was the one in the Azara. Shesham Sorfim, Psulei Kodshe Kodshim, V'imurei Kodshim Kalim, Uparim and Israfim, Usirim and Israfim, Shira Be'em Sul. Here we go, the difference. Okay, so the Kodshe Kodshim, they get disqualified. The parts are supposed to get burnt if the Kodshim Kalim on the Mizbeach, they get disqualified. And the Parim and Israfim and Sirim and Israfim, that had some sort of disqualification. Bein kodem zrika, bein lachar zrika. It doesn't matter whether it's before zrika or after zrika. What determines? Ubeta. Okay, what determines? We're going to see in a minute. They don't even say it, but they've got disqualified in the azara, in the walls of the azara. Ubeit HaDeshen acher haya b'Har HaBayit. Now you can figure out what that was used for. Shesham Sorfim Parim and Israfim Usirim and Israfim Shira Be'em Sul B'Yitziatan. Once they left the temple, the azara walls, the courtyard, and they go out. If they get disqualified there, then they get burnt in the Har HaBayit. And if it was done everything properly, chutz l'shalosh machanot. Then in the Beit HaDeshen, it's outside the three camps. Again, outside Jerusalem. Okay, we're going to end today's daf with three questions. And you're going to see we're going to have no answers to these questions. We're going to have a few circular things here. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the first question. Lina, it's not such a crazy Rabbi Yirmiyah question this time. Lina ma'u she'te'il b'parim and Israfim v'sirim and Israfim. Normally, in sacrifices, if you leave them overnight, they become disqualified, right? Depending on what it is, but let's say you didn't do the blood, so disqualified. Okay, what about the Parim and Israfim and Sirim and Israfim? And why would you think there's no lina? Well, miyam rinan ki mahanya lina bebasal debar achila. Maybe lina works when the basal can be eaten. Okay, maybe it's only when the meat gets eaten. Now, eaten could be consumed by the mizbeach, which is like the ola, or when the meat is consumed by people, like the shlamim, okay, or the chatan and the asham. So maybe lina only works in something where someone eventually is going to eat the meat, or the mizbeach is going to consume the meat. We saw that similarity in Pigul about whether there's achila either by the altar or by a human. Aval hani tela b'nei achila ninu lo. But these don't get eaten by anybody; they just get burned. So maybe lina's not a disqualification here. Oh, dilma loshna, or maybe there's no difference. So we're going to have a few attempts to answer this question. First, we're going to have Rava, who actually says, "Oh, I heard Abai ask this question. I heard him answer from here." Amar Rava, hamilti Abai leila Abai. Okay, Abai had this question, pashat la lemeha. Then he answered it from this source, but then we'll reject it. Vishavin she'im chishev, this is machloket, but they all agree she'im chishev ba'achilat parim u'b'schreifatan shelo asa klum. They all agree that there's no pigul for Parim and Israfim and Sirim and Israfim. So he says, If there's no pigul, the machshava of doing it in the wrong time doesn't disqualify. My lab mida machshava lo pasla, lina nani lo pasla. Now he seems to think, okay, there's a lot more to think about in this sugya, like why lina would be dependent on eating, why lina and pigul would be the same, okay? But if there's no pigul thought that can mess up your parim and nisrafim and sirim and nisrafim, then it seems like there's no lina. Well, the Gemara is going to reject this. No, Dilma Machshava Udalo Pasla Valina Pasla. Okay, if we had time, right, and we were in a sheer we'd think about what are these two approaches, why to connect these two ideas. So, but we're not going to do that today. Anyway, we're going to say, no, Pigul is Pigul and Lina is Lina. They're two completely different disqualifications. Who's to say we're going to learn one from the other? Tashma. So that was the first attempt at answer, unsuccessful. Second attempt. Let's learn from here. Parim and Nisrafim, Sirim Nisrafim. It's a Mishnah in Me'ilah. Mo'alim bahem mishuk dishu. When does the isser of me'ilah, that you'll be liable for misuse of consecrated property, start to tick? As soon as the clock starts ticking, as soon as you designate the animal and you say, I'm going to use this for the Parlim Gavashol Tzibor, for example. So immediately then, if anyone uses it for some other purpose, just takes the animal, plows with it, problem. Okay, isser me'ilah. Nishchetu, but once they're slaughtered, all sorts of other things start ticking. What? Well, huchsheruli pasel, they can already potentially become impure by b'tful yom or mechusar kippurim, right? Someone who's a tful yom who went to the mikveh but it's waiting for sunset, or still needs to bring a korban, who's not allowed to come in contact with sacrificial meat. Ubilina or lina, what do you see? Lina is a disqualification. Now, my love lina pasal. But doesn't this mean lina pasar, which we were talking about, the meat of the animal that has to be brought completely out of the temple, and that would prove it? Say, no, that doesn't give us an answer. Loli not imurim. You could say, no, it's talking about the imurim. The parts that get burned on the altar. Those there's lina, because those get consumed by the altar. But we're not necessarily talking about the meat, that, the whole animal, which gets taken outside, which never gets consumed on any altar or by people. Okay, but now they're going to say, how could you say it's talking about imurim and not the basar? Because look at the end of that Mishnah. We're going to prove that the end of the Mishnah is talking about meat, and therefore this must be talking about meat as well. Hami de seifa katane, kulam moalim behem bebeit hadeshen, the me'ilah continues, okay, from the zman of hakdasha, when you designate it, all the way until the meat becomes consumed by the fire. So, obviously, they're talking about the meat. So, meat to seifa basar, reshanami basar, since that's meat, this must be meat, to which the Gemara rejects that and says, what are you talking about? Midi iria, seifa basar, resha imurim. You could say very easily that the seifa is meat, but the resha is talking about the imurim, and that doesn't teach us anything about the lina of the meat that gets burned outside. Okay, next, third attempt, and also we'll reject, Tashma Ditani Levi. This is the one that's going to come back, and we're going to do a little circular arguing here. Levi brought a braita. Shirabem sulbi yitziatan. Okay, if you remember, Levi had this braita where he said, right? Remember that was the braita we saw before about where you burn the different things. And what did he say there? He said if there was a psul when they left, right, then you would burn it outside. So, my lav lina, what kind of psul could happen to it outside? Not lina. Oh, could be lina, but the Gemara says no. It could be lo psul tuma. It could have become impure, or psul yitzia, or it could have been that, let's say, maybe you did it before the blood was sprinkled and you took it outside, and that would be a disqualification of yotze, right? Remember, you can, obviously it's not disqualified by taking it out because you're going to take it out anyway, but it could be disqualified, although this is going to be the next question, could be disqualified if you took it out before the blood was sprinkled when it's not yet permitted to take out of the azara. Okay, that's actually the next question, but right now, that's why it's going to be a little circular. Right now, they're assuming it could be talking about that case. Now the Gemara is going to ask directly about that case. Rabbi Elazar is going to ask by Rabbi Elazar. Okay, wait. Does taking it out before the blood is sprinkled, is that a disqualification? Now, where are we going to learn this from? Well, my coming by. So first of all, right now they're going to assume that the question is, what if I just took the parim and nisrafim out in a normal situation? So the Gemara is going to say, what kind of question is that? Of course, it's not a problem. You're supposed to take it out. It's not like the Kodesh Kodeshim that has to stay in the Asara. This is meant to go out and be burned far outside. So that can't be a disqualification. So my coming by, what on earth is this question? But they're going to explain it the way I just did, which is Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. Aliba demanda amal, according to the one who says in the Shlamim. Now we're going to compare it to a Shlam. Shlamim, the meat can go out, but only after the blood is sprinkled. And if you hold that Adayin, there's a machloket about this. Adayin lo higiyaz mano latzeit. If it wasn't yet time for it to go out, meaning the blood wasn't sprinkled, mi amrinan hani mile basar de ein sofo latzei chova. Now maybe you would say, okay, if you hold that the shlamim meat I took out before zrika, it's disqualified. Maybe that's meat, because meat, there's no obligation for me to take the shlamim outside the temple, outside the azara. Now, I could, and obviously I most likely will, but it's not like there's a Torah law that says you must take the meat out. It just means you can take the meat out of the azara. You can also cook it and eat it in the azara. But there's no obligation. Aval hane, but in this case, just so fun, let's say tchova, here there's an obligation to take the meat outside. So wouldn't you think, maybe it's not disqualified if you took it out too early, because anyway, there's a mitzvah ultimately to take it out, or an obligation to take it out. Or maybe you say, no, in the end, it wasn't its time to take it out, and therefore it's disqualified. So Tashma, we're going to go back to that source of Levi now. Titani Levi, Shirabu Psul, B'Yitziato. If the Psul happened when you took it out, then you're going to burn it on Harabayit. My La Psul Yitzia, is it not? What would happen? Oh, maybe you took it out too early. No. La Psul Tuma, Psul Lina. Now they come full circle. Maybe it means it was disqualified because it became impure, or maybe it means you left it overnight, which we said before. We don't know it necessarily means that, but we're playing kind of devil's advocate. Well, maybe it means that, so we can't prove anything conclusively. Okay, last question for today by Rabbi Elazar. Parim v'nisrafim usirim v'nisrafim sheyatzaru bo bebiut ever mahu. What if you have parim v'nisrafim usirim v'nisrafim that they went out, they were taken out, okay, the majority of them, but of the majority of the animal that went out, you had a minority part of a limb that was still like the majority of the limb was out, but a minority of it was in. Okay? A minority of it was out and the majority of it was inside. So maybe it's not considered that it was taken outside because that small part that got us over the 50% to say, this is Yotze, is actually connected more and is going to follow the majority of the limb that's still inside. And then it wouldn't be considered that it was taken outside. Do we say, Hach miyuta de'ever bataruva shadinale? We take this minority of the aver and we say, this minority part of a limb is really connected with the majority part, which is inside. V'hatlo nafikle, and that didn't go out then. Or maybe we go by, look, the majority of the animal, who cares whether the limb or not? To which the Gemara says, no, this creates a question, there's no way this is what they asked. Obviously, the majority of the animal out, it goes by the majority of the animal. We're not going to say, the majority of the limb is more important than the majority of the animal. That for sure is considered out. But here's our question, and we're going to end with the teku. What if exactly 50% was out, and the majority of a limb was in the part that was out, and a little part of it was in? Do we say, batar, haimiuta de ever, the little bit that was in, do we say it follows the majority, batarov, ever shadin le, and therefore it's as if the majority of the animal went out. Vahanafikle, right, and it's out. O dilma, batar behema shadin le, or maybe we say, no, it's 50-50 of the animal, there is no majority of the animal that went out, it's not considered that it left the asara, and maybe we go like that, and we end with a question. Okay, quick summary of our long daf and complicated one. So we started with this contradiction between the Mishnah and the other Mishnah, and we resolved it in two possible ways, either all completely according to one or completely according to the other. Rabbi Shimon and Rebbe. We tried to say it's Machloket Tanaim. Okay, then we went to Rabbi Chanina's Kana Kohanim. We asked 4 difficulties on him, resolved them all, and with that we explained better what Rabbi Akiva was saying. And we had a Machloket about how exactly we passed it. Then we got to the Parim and the Srafim and the Sirim and the Srafim, how exactly it went, where the 3 Batei Desha were, what they were all used for, and some different opinions about that. And then we ended with these 3 questions about Lina, Yotze, and about this majority of the limb and all that. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.